Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Dahlia and I'm from Georgia, which is in the southeastern part of the United States, with exquisitely beautiful terrain that consists of pretty beaches, rolling verdant farmland and statuesque mountains. I live in the northern part of Georgia in an idyllic countrified Georgian-style home with a pretty pond, some undulating green lawns, a stables for our 3 horses, some grazing fields, a large apple orchard, and a magnificent resplendent wood green consisting of maples, pines, oaks and hickories. My incredulous Bigfoot story begins in the summer of 2006 when I was living in my wholesome family home with my devoted husband Bob and my mischievous rambunctious son Alex, who was about 7 at the time. I'm afraid to have to admit that Alex was growing up to be a little scallywag and the biggest fibber of all time. As a mother, I had absolutely no comprehension of how elaborated, multifaceted and prodigious his lying had actually become. He was such an excellent liar that he could lie without batting an eyelid. Alex always wanted to be one better than anybody else in his entire class at school, and to convey much more dramatic, outlandish stories than anybody else, that would invariably make him become the centre of attention. On one occasion at school, the kids had to talk about their mother in front of the class and describe what it was about their mothers that made them unusually special, as it was all in aid of Mother's Day. Paul, one of the boys, got up and told everyone in the class, "My mummy only has one breast, 'cause the other one got cut off because of cancer. Daddy says mummy's very, very brave." Everyone was exclaiming how sorry they were for his poor mother and how incredibly brave she was. "Miss Cooper? Miss Cooper?" "Yes, Alex, what is it?" "My mummy had both of her breasts cut off. She's also got a wooden leg as well. My mummy's braver than Paul's." "Well, your mother's very brave, but so is Paul's." Everybody was so shocked, and of course my son delighted in the attention he received. The teacher agreed heartily that I was very brave indeed. Then another boy called Derek got up and proceeded to tell everybody that he had 2 fathers because his mother recently got divorced, which meant he got twice as many Christmas gifts at Christmas every year. Once again, my assiduous little boy raised his hand and said, "Miss Cooper? Miss Cooper?" "Yes, Alex, what is it?" "My mummy has been married for 5 times, so I have 5 daddies and 5 times more Christmas presents." When Alex made up these melodramatic, magnified claims, he received so much attention from everyone. I was to learn that some of the children's parents would actually pack an extra cookie in their kids' lunchbox just for Alex. Give that to the poor boy, whose mother's got a wooden leg, they would say. Bless him. Mrs. Cooper, his teacher, also showed him special attention, which he lapped up like a dog that was given an extra helping of sausage. Imagine what everybody secretly thought about me. I was the poor kid's mother that was wobbling around precariously on one wooden leg with no breasts and had been through hundreds of failed marriages with 5 different fathers. I mean, it didn't get worse than that, did it? What kind of a bizarre picture was my son painting of me? But what gets me the most is everybody believed him. None of these stories were true, of course, but they circulated around the school like a rampant wildfire that was out of control. I would always notice the mothers at the school gate glancing surreptitiously at my legs and chest, and I began to feel quite self-conscious. One day it was the egg and spoon race at Alex's school, and Alex's teacher, Mrs. Cooper, went to the trouble of singling me out for special favour. She brought me a comfortable upholstered chair to sit on in order to watch the games, while everybody else was sitting on plastic, very uncomfortable chairs. It made me feel very awkward, as everybody was staring at me, and I hated being the centre of attention. Mrs. Cooper nudged me and assured me that I didn't have to take part in the egg and spoon race under the delicate circumstances of my condition. I had no idea what she was talking about, but I was so embarrassed and humiliated that I never said a word and just sat there like a great big lump of cookie dough, looking like a complete and utter idiot, and wishing with all my heart that the ground would swallow me whole. On one occasion when I was picking up Alex from school, a random woman came dashing up to me with a piteous, concerned look on her face, handing me a book with the title, How to Keep Your Husband Still Interested in You Years After Your Marriage. I think you will find it very useful, she said. There's some good pointers in there to keep the spark alive in your marriage. I remember thinking, what a hell of a cheek! Why would a strange woman I'd never seen a day in my life have the brass nerve, insolence and contempt to present me with such a peculiar book? Was she trying to suggest that my husband was losing interest in me? That was very hard to stomach. Then there was another time when one of the garrulous mothers at Alex's school invited me out for lunch to ask me for special advice as she was getting divorced, and proceeded to go into avid detail about the hopeless, dilapidated state of her broken marriage. It's so good to share all this with someone who really understands what I'm going through, she exclaimed. The excitable woman couldn't stop talking about herself. She barely stopped to draw breath. She then asked me if I could recommend a good divorce lawyer for her. I told her I didn't know any good divorce lawyers, and I was desperately sorry about that. I wished I could have been of better help. Oh, that's so terrible, she exclaimed. You must have had such rotten luck. You poor, poor thing, she said, taking my hand and squeezing it. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone should ask me for legal advice. I mean, what did I know about the law? My husband thought that the woman might believe I was in the legal profession, a lawyer or something. If that wasn't enough weirdness for you, I was asked by the school principal to represent a cancer charity at the school, which I did think was decidedly odd, given that I'd never had cancer myself. I'm sure everybody would love to hear your story, I was told. But I haven't got a story to tell, I assured her. Now, my dear, don't be so modest. I'm sure you have quite a story to tell. And in my book, it's women like you that are my heroes. I can only imagine the pretentious and theatrical stories my son continued to make up at school, but at home he lied non-stop about everything as well. He would tell me that his teddy bear could talk Hebrew. I would humour him and say, "Oh, that's nice, sweetheart. Maybe he can teach you how to speak it." "He doesn't want to teach me," he said. "Oh, that's a pity," I said. "He's not a very nice teddy bear then, is he?" One day when I scolded my son for spilling his drink all over the kitchen floor as an act of defiance because I told him he needed to bath, and he absolutely loathed bathing, he told me that he didn't like me, and neither did the horses in our stable, who had personally told him what a dreadful mother I was, and that they didn't like me at all. At this my husband laughed and asked him why the horses didn't like Mummy. You could see my son trying to think fast on his feet with what crazy fabricated story he could come up with next. "They don't like her, 'cause she's very, very smelly." "What does Mummy smell of, Alex?" my husband asked. "She smells like a pig," my son said. Lovely, I thought. My son is quite the charmer. One weekend when my elderly mother who was looking after Alex, while my husband and I went away for a romantic weekend break together, I returned home to see my mother looking at me with enraged, furious eyes. I'd never seen her this fired up before. She looked mad as hell. "How could you?" she said. "I didn't raise you to be like this." "What's wrong, Mum?" I asked. "I know what you did to my grandchild," she informed me. "Alex told me everything, and quite frankly, I'm utterly appalled and disgusted with you. I never thought a daughter of mine was capable of this abysmal treatment. He's only a child, for goodness sake. This is tantamount to abuse." "What did I do, Mum?" I groaned. "Out with it now." "Alex told me how you locked him up in his bedroom for an entire day and night, with no food, when he was very naughty. You can't do that to a growing little boy. He also told me that you confiscated all his toys for 2 whole weeks, so he had nothing to play with at all. How could you be so heartless and cruel?" "That's not true, Mum," I said. "I never locked him in his room. He's lying to you. And I've never confiscated his toys, ever." I was to discover that my little conniving, masterful little boy had successfully bamboozled his grandmother to buy him all the toys he'd been begging us to get him for ages. We had firmly both told him no, and it would seem that he had cunningly managed to manipulate his grandmother by pretending he'd been so hard done by both his parents. For in my mother's disgust at my appalling parenting techniques, my mother had brought Alex absolutely everything he wanted, with no expense spared, toy cars and the likes, and he looked like the cat that had got the cream. He was quick in learning that this guileful technique of his had huge fringe benefits and payoffs that were very rewarding. As you can imagine, I was growing increasingly concerned about my son's reckless, unbridled fibbing, because it was getting seriously out of hand as far as I was concerned. I even sent him to a very well-known psychologist who assured me he'd grow out of the lying, and he was possibly making these stories up to be the centre of attention, which was something I already knew. "Your son is as bright as a button," he told me. "Granted he's lying and makes up stories all the time, but he has a quick-witted, fertile imagination which should never be crushed or stifled. On the contrary, it should be encouraged. It's kids like him that end up becoming inspirational great novelists like the Stephen Kings of this world. You do not want to discourage his creative imagination. You need to humour him. Of course, as he gets older, you need to get a little tough on him if he's becoming rather headstrong, audacious and undisciplined, for he does need to know right from wrong." After meeting with the psychologist, I was feeling a lot better, but I was to learn from one of the mothers at school that after one of the kids at school announced that her parents ate snails and garlic along with frog legs in France, everyone upon listening to this proceeded to express their shock and distaste at such a thing. My little boy piped, "Well, Miss Cooper, my mum eats crawling snails and frogs from the garden like sweets." Everybody went, "Ugh, that is so disgusting." And of course Alex loved it. So now everybody believed that Alex had a one-legged mother with no breasts that got through as many husbands as people eat hot dinners and was feasting on garden snails and frogs like sweets. And let's not forget, I smelt atrocious like a pig, and my horses didn't like me either. There was one occasion when not trusting my son backfired on me, when Alex informed me in a nonchalant way that there was a fire ablaze in the kitchen, burning down the kitchen blinds, and of course I didn't believe him. Finally I got to smell the rancid smoke for myself and raced to the kitchen in a desperate panic. I had accidentally left a pan of oil on the gas hob to cook some sausages for Alex, and I had become distracted and forgotten all about it, and my kitchen nearly went down in flames, but I fought the flames with my fire extinguisher and thankfully won that battle. Like many parents, I did find putting Alex in front of the television did help to entertain him and keep him occupied, and he liked all kinds of programmes, including stories about Bigfoot. Indeed, he was so enamoured and fascinated by Bigfoot that he spoke of nothing else. One day he told me that Bigfoot was knocking on his window at night and beckoning to him to go and play with him outside. I remember saying, "That's nice, dear. Why don't you go and play with him?" I was getting increasingly tired of his incorrigible lies. Before long, Alex was telling me all kinds of tall stories about a little boy Bigfoot called Applejack that was playing ball with him with the plums in the orchard, and that his mother Sagebrush had a long jagged scar down her torso and big sad eyes. Alex told me that he'd given Applejack some of his toy cars because it made him so happy, and they loved playing together. I just said, "That's a very interesting story, dear," and that I was pleased that he was generous with his toys. Alex informed me that Applejack lived in the forest with Sagebrush and was very lonely and sad because his dad and brother were both dead, as they'd been killed by a couple of nasty hunters with guns. As you can imagine, I naturally assumed my son was up to his old tricks, making up all these incredulous stories, but I must admit I was impressed with what a proficient storyteller he was, and with what imaginative names he'd come up with, although it was such a pity it was all lies. After all, you can only cry wolf so many times. Every time I needed a babysitter, which was actually quite often, as my husband and I were quite social and went out regularly, I would hire our next-door neighbour's girl called Chantelle, who was always eager to make some money. She was a pretty slender 17-year-old girl with long dark hair, blue eyes and fair skin. Chantelle was permanently superglued to her cell phone all day and night, always tapping away at the keys of her cell non-stop, like a proficient secretary. I would sometimes hear the tail end of her conversation, and it was invariably always about boys. "Oh, he's so cute," she'd gush. "Or I went out with him once and he was real loser. Don't give him a second look." I knew then that even though her young head was permanently in the clouds and caught up in her girly telephone conversations, she was still reliable enough to take care of Alex, as long as she managed to multitask and look up from her cell phone from time to time, just to ensure Alex wasn't getting up to too much mischief. My son absolutely adored Chantelle, and they would order pizza together, eat lots of ice cream and watch television. And he would chatter away, filling her head with all kinds of fictitious, marvellous stories. He even told her that my husband had a glass eye once, and Chantelle actually believed him. I had warned Chantelle of my son's overactive imagination and his ardent passion for telling fibs all the time, and she knew better than to rely on a single word he told her. But sometimes it was hard to doubt him, because he was an artful liar at the very best of times. One day when I returned home, I discovered that Chantelle looked panicked and dismayed, because my son Alex was nowhere to be found. "He told me he was going to play with Bigfoot, and I just humoured him," she said. "But when I looked up from my cell phone, he'd just vanished." "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Madison," she cried. I really should have been more careful." "Calm down," I said. "Put down your cell for once in your life, and let's find him together. He can't have gone that far." As any mother will tell you, losing a kid is a mother's worst, most terrifying nightmare, as all kinds of horrific scenarios go ripping and racing through your head at 1,000 miles an hour. And one of the most dreadful and ghastly of all is the prospect of drowning. The haunting thought that Alex, who couldn't swim, may have wandered off to the pond and accidentally fallen into the depths of the deep, cold, icy water sent waves of dread through my entire being. This kind of nightmare can all too easily happen to the best of us, as any parent will tell you. I had warned Alex not to go near that pond on countless occasions, but he was a disobedient rogue at the very best of times. I was in too much of a flurry to think clearly, as terror literally shot through my body like a steam train on full throttle, and in my blind panic, I began to function like a robot on autopilot. I literally dived into that pond in all my clothes, feeling around desperately for my son beneath the icy cold, freezing water, but there was no sign of him, much to my relief. In my rampaging frenzy, I gallivanted around the whole house like a bull in a china shop, frantically dripping water everywhere from my soaking clothes that literally clung to my body like sopping rags. Then I darted aimlessly around to the apple orchards and stables with the alarmed Chantelle running behind me. I kept shouting out his name in desperation. "Alex! Alex! Alex! Where are you, Alex?" Finally, there was one place I hadn't searched. It was the wood green, but Alex knew he wasn't allowed to go in there on his own. I told Chantelle to take her car and drive around the neighbourhood looking for Alex, while I searched the woods. As I ran into the wooded area, I could hear Alex's raised, animated voice, along with laughter and chuckles. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Without a second thought, I raced towards his voice, stopping dead in my tracks because I could barely believe what I was discerning. My son was seated on the ground next to a little 3-foot Bigfoot that was possibly as young as he was, and they were playing with his selection of cars together. Both of them were making similar brimming sounds, brrr, brrr, and dragging their cars on the ground and occasionally colliding into each other and crashing. The little Bigfoot looked so human-like it was almost uncanny, only he was covered in long golden brown hair and had exceedingly long arms and a pyramid-shaped head with very soulful animated golden eyes. Standing in watch over my son and the little Bigfoot was a guardian-like large female Bigfoot, and the sheer size of her was so intimidating that I was overwhelmed and seized with absolute, total and utter terror. In that moment I stood there on the spot, frozen like a block of ice, hardly daring to move. I would say she was about 8 foot tall, 600 pounds, and although she was slim, I could see that every single area of her body was covered in dense muscle. I noticed that the hair over her large breasts and her chest area was exceedingly scant, and I could see that there was a nasty-looking jagged scar running down her chest to above the top of her streamlined belly. I am almost certain that those were scars caused from gunshots, which made me feel very queasy and very ashamed of being human. I could tell someone had definitely tried to kill her. Suddenly sensing my presence, the female turned around, swiveling her head and shoulders together in my direction, and she looked up at me, and our eyes met for a moment. I could feel the sadness and turmoil within the depths of her golden eyes, and I knew she was a creature that was grieving a dreadful, calamitous loss in her life. It would seem that she really was suffering emotionally. After looking directly at her eyes, my fears dissipated as fast as the steam from a kettle, for I perceived that she was very kind. I spoke gently to her and pointed to my son, saying, "I've come to get my boy." The female Bigfoot seemed to understand and called out to her own son in a chattering sound that sounded rather like she was calling his name, and he abandoned the toy cars he was playing with and ran obediently to her side, watching me ever so curiously. I walked over to Alex and hugged him, sobbing slightly as I cradled him in my arms. "Oh, Alex," I cried, "you gave me such a scare." I took him by his little hand and led him away, glancing directly at the female Bigfoot, and our eyes locked again in an understanding. She stood there not moving a muscle or flinching, as she watched me silently, walking away with Alex. "But, Mummy, I want to play with Applejack. I want to play with Applejack." During the weeks and days that followed, I never told my husband, nor anybody else that matter, about the Bigfoot that I'd encountered in the woods. It wasn't because I cared whether people believed me or not, but because I was trying to digest what I'd seen and come to terms with it myself. I knew at once that the benevolent, benign and congenial mother Bigfoot would never ever harm Alex. I found myself thinking about her all the time. My heart went out to her. I wondered all about her personal tragic story, and who had shot her, and whether my son's story about her family being taken out by hunters was in fact true. I began to suspect it was an accurate account, and a very likely scenario, and I felt strangely protective towards the poor female Bigfoot and her son, as life had been callously cruel for the both of them, and they certainly deserved better. I knew if they stayed on our land that they would be safe, although as incongruous as it sounds, I did hope that they would keep their distance from Alex. I didn't want to encourage my son's relationship with the little Bigfoot, because Bigfoots are so massive that if they play rough with you, they could ultimately harm you or even kill you, based just on their huge size. I instructed my son that he wasn't to play with the little Bigfoot again, and he promised me he wouldn't, and I never actually saw the Bigfoots again, which was a mixed bag of blessings for me. This is my son's side of the story. Hi, I'm Alex, and I assure you that my mother is not exaggerating at all about my terrible lying when I was growing up. For some reason I loved making up all kinds of stories, as it made me become the centre of attention, and I loved that. I also enjoyed shocking people and telling them things that would really horrify them and make them gasp with astonishment, as their reactions were always fabulous. I've always enjoyed stirring the pot, and even as a teenager, I was the biggest prankster ever. When I was little, I found there were amazing perks to making up stories like treats and gifts that I would be given all the time. I made the most terrible, outrageous stories up about my mother, and everybody thought that she had a wooden leg and no breasts and feasted on our garden snails. I told everyone that my dad had a glass eye and was missing all the toes on his feet, and that shocked people as well. The funny part of it all was that people actually believed me, but it was like the high you get from drugs. The more sensational my lies became, the more shocked my audience, the greater the buzz. I think I was a fabulous manipulator, even if I say so myself. Of course, when I did encounter Applejack and told my mother about the experience, she never believed me, and frankly, who could blame her? After all, there are only so many times you can cry wolf. It was such a long time ago when I had that friendship with Applejack, and his really sweet mother Sagebrush, but I do seem to remember knowing that his whole family had been killed by hunters, and his mother Sagebrush had managed to escape with her life after receiving multiple gunshots to her chest area. I remember she had a jagged, ugly scar down her front where her hair could not grow back. I do not know how she survived, but she actually did, and thankfully was able to raise Applejack. I sensed that she was not bitter nor hateful towards human beings, but she was sad and lonely. I think she felt her kind are often misunderstood and harshly judged. I played with her little one all the time, but I knew it would be short-lived, because they told me that they never stayed in one place for very long, as they were nomads, wandering from one place to another. Also, Sagebrush wanted to find her sister Merrylegs, as she was so desperately lonely without any adult company of her own kind. It's weird. I do often wonder to myself how I knew all this information, but I truly think my mind was fed all this by the Bigfoots in some form of telepathic exchange, of which I cannot explain, because I would just know things about them in my mind, like what their names were, their plans for the future, the cave that they lived in the woods, and stuff like that. I must confess, even though my mother told me never to play with Applejack again, I firmly disobeyed her, and would surreptitiously sneak out at night to visit him in the woods, and we would play together in the large cave covered with deerskins. I really loved Applejack and Sagebrush, as they were so friendly and convivial towards me. I would often raid our fridge and bring them fruits and biscuits, which they loved to eat. I do not believe that Bigfoots would have ever hurt me, as they were more gentle than any humans I know. One day they told me they were going away, and I literally cried and cried for days. I do remember that. I never ever saw them again, and I do miss them. I am now 21 years old, and my focus is to become a fictional writer of horror, which may be why I've always loved to shock people in the past. Perhaps all the incessant lying as a kid helped my fertile imagination after all. And who knows, one day I might be the next Stephen King. So for all the non-believers out there, Bigfoot is real. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Russell, although people tend to call me Russ for short, and I'm from Wisconsin, which is a Midwestern state in the United States of America, well known for its two magnificent Great Lakes, namely Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, with an interior of dreamy forests and ubiquitous natural farmland. I grew up in the delightful city of Elk Grove, in an exquisite lakefront property with sensational panoramic views. At the time of my story, I resided in one of those typical ranch-style homes with both of my parents and my sporty, adventurous sister Carly. Wisconsin is also known as the Great White North, where we experience winter like few other places in Northern America, which is why they call this the frozen tundra, for indeed some of our cities are considered colder than places in Alaska. Growing up in the early 90s, my sister and I were incredibly privileged and fortunate to have a very idyllic, peaceful and pleasurable childhood, as our happy-go-lucky parents were mellow, long-suffering and undemanding people who barely ever got their feathers ruffled and never raised their voices at us once, nor did they ever swear or lose their tempers. For indeed, the only time I ever once heard my mother release an F-bomb is when she slammed her toe really hard into a wooden cabinet, and hurt herself quite badly, and another time when she was removing a chocolate cake from the oven and unfortunately slipped and plunged the cake and its contents all over the floor. Both our fun-loving parents actively encouraged us to spend all our spare time out of doors. My father emphatically believed fresh air and exercise would make us hale and hearty and were essential tools for all growing kids. I always adored the panoramic, exquisite snow-covered white landscapes of the winter months and the large mountain slopes in Wisconsin. It enabled me to develop a reverent passion for challenging winter sports like cross-country skiing, snowboarding and snowshoeing, as there was no end to the fun activities you can engage in with the snow. Little did I realise that my appreciation for the cold weather and this intriguing white substance from nature would ultimately impact my career path later on in life, as you will soon discover. My first idiosyncratic, unorthodox encounter with the hairy critter, otherwise known as Bigfoot, was on our own property, where the rear of our land was surrounded by a dense area of woodgreen, consisting of very mature statuesque aspen, beeches and birch trees. Those were the days when we never had heard of Bigfoot before, so my first encounter with the strange creature was nothing short of incredulous. It all began in the winter of 1993, when my sister and I constructed a very sizable, cheerful-looking snowman in our backyard, which was something we did every single winter like clockwork after heavy snowfall. After all, every backyard should be graced with the presence of a quintessential snowman in winter. Our snowman would wear my father's old black bowler hat on his head, with blue marbles for its eyes, a massive carrot for its nose, and several red glacé cherries for its mouth, along with a striped scarf that belonged to my father around its neck. It would seem that the nose and the mouth kept needing replacing regularly because the carrots and cherries would mysteriously vanish, and we were perturbed as to who or what was pinching the carrots and the cherries. I was secretly convinced my father was playing tricks on us, as he had a wacko sense of humour at the time and was the greatest trickster of all, but he insisted that he was not stealing our carrots, nor taking the cherries. One day my sister Carly and I awoke to find that not only were the carrots and cherries mysteriously missing from the snowman, but there was actually a long trail of telltale footprints that led directly from the snowman into the heart of the woods. "Look," I said to my sister, "I think these footprints belong to the perpetrator of our missing carrots and cherries." "But the feet are so big," said my sister, putting her foot into the huge impression in the ground. "Look how big the print is compared to my own foot." I was stunned by how tiny my sister's foot was compared to these footprints in the snow. Who could have feet this big, I wondered, for you'd have to be like a giant to have feet this large. It was a curious conundrum for me. In our eager enthusiasm and heightened curiosity, we began to follow the trail of footprints directly in the snow to the heart of the woods. Imagine our immense surprise when they led directly to a large igloo-like structure that would have been very inconspicuous to us if the footprints hadn't been such a clear giveaway sign. Whoever this individual was, he clearly wasn't very good at concealing his tracks. The sizable rounded shell-like structure was exceedingly large and very cleverly constructed, with a vast framework of tree branches that were used as the scaffolding that was cemented together with dense quantities of snow. The snow-covered frame was set against a rocky outcrop that I imagine provided a great windbreak. My sister and I crept up to the igloo to peek inside, and we could see this large bundle of grey fur lying curled up in a large ball, with its back facing away from us. It looked like a massive fur coat lying in this space. The strange critter appeared to be snoring loudly, and he sounded exactly like my dad, who really does snort like a pig when he sleeps, something which drives my mother insanely crazy. At first I thought it must be a bear that was lying in this igloo, but then bears don't have grey hair, do they? I also remembered the footprints in the snow that clearly did not belong to a bear. Besides, I've never heard of a bear coming out of hibernation to pinch a few carrots and a handful of glacé cherries. My sister and I cautiously crept away from the shelter and surreptitiously hid behind a very large, sizable birch tree, while I deliberately threw a large snowball at the igloo, in the hope that we could rouse the unsuspecting critter out of its deep slumber, and it seemed to have worked. Fortunately, our snowball did make a loud crashing sound as it thumped against the opening. That was when we saw the massive critter tentatively stick his huge pyramid-shaped head out of the igloo, with a startled, bewildered and befuddled expression upon his long, wrinkled, human-like face. He began furtively looking around him, to the left and to the right, and to the front and to the back, and then prudently inspecting his structure to ensure that it wasn't falling apart. We watched in awe as this elderly critter hobbled around his den, examining it from every side and angle, moving ever so slowly. He proceeded to cement some more snow onto the igloo with his massive hands, and finally satisfied, retreated back into his structure. I think he must have believed that some snow had literally come off his igloo, and he was trying to fix it. My sister and I stared at this thing in disbelief, because this doddering critter looked exactly like a man, but he wasn't fully human, as there were fleeting ape-like influences to his humanoid appearance. We could tell that the critter was long in the tooth, for he shuffled around like a geriatric old man, and looked dithery and muddled, which made him rather endearing to us. I would describe him as being about 7 foot tall and 500 pounds, and covered with long, flowing, exceedingly matted grey hair, with bald patches on his knees, parts of his chest, and under his arms. I could discern that the shrivelling, enfeebled critter was suffering from the withering, decaying effects of severe muscular wastage, and was very thin, emaciated and lanky, but I believe at one time in his prime he must have been very large indeed. I was not afraid of the critter at all, because he seemed like a likeable, disorientated old man, and I actually felt incredibly sorry for him, alone in the snow like this. "What is he?" asked my sister earnestly, as we made tracks back to the house. "He looks human, but not quite human. You know what I mean." "I don't know," I said, "but I think that whatever he is, he's very old, and is struggling to survive. It's hard out here in the cruel elements, and judging by how slow and dithery he is, I can't imagine that he's much of a hunter. I honestly don't know how he's managing to survive out there, on his own. Nature can be so cruel. That's why he probably was pinching our carrot and our glacé cherries." "We must help him," said my sister. "I feel ever so sorry for him. He looks so lost and confused. I mean, where is his family? Should they not be taking care of him? Why have they abandoned him like this?" "Well, maybe they're migrants," I suggested, "and left him behind for the winter, because he's too slow to accompany them to a warmer place." I knew I wanted to help the strange critter living in the igloo, for who or whatever he was most certainly past his prime, and desperately needed our help. And if he'd been stealing the carrots from our snowman, he must be very hungry indeed, and that bothered me greatly. Over the weeks that followed, my sister and I would throw snowy balls at the igloo to awaken the critter from his sleep. He would rustle around in the igloo, hobbling out of the opening, and he would find apples, carrots, brown bread and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches outside his igloo. We would hide behind a tree, watching the critter. He would look so puzzled as he studied the food on the ground, and his expression was so dumbfounded and astonished. We would watch him scratching his head, and the wrinkles on his forehead would crinkle up deeply, as if he was wondering where on earth the food had come from. On one occasion, a large bird flew over the igloo-like structure, and his eyes lit up brightly, and he waved excitedly at the bird. I'm convinced he thought the bird had sent him manna from heaven. Sometimes when we left food out for him, he would look around him with his concerned deep eyes, looking from the right and to the left, and even up the trees, as if trying to discern where the food had mysteriously appeared from. And then he would quickly grab the food and hastily retreat back into the igloo, almost as if he was worried that something or someone would try and steal it away from him. I knew that we were making his life a whole lot easier and better by bringing him food, and it felt good to help the poor critter. One day we threw a snowball at the igloo, and the critter did not respond to us at all, and that happened for several consecutive days. By this stage I was certain that the critter was dead, and of course I was right, because we went into the cave and surreptitiously reached into the opening to poke the critter very hard with a stick. He did not respond to us at all, so we poked him even harder, and he still did not react. That was when I reached out to touch the critter with my hand, and he was as hard as a brick and as solid as ice. The poor critter must have died in his sleep, and my sister and I began to cry, because we had grown so fond of him. For several days my sister and I spent ages digging a hole in the ground for the critter, and we dragged him along the ground and pushed him into the shallow grave. We conducted our own little funeral service for him because he was so alone in the world, and we felt that he deserved to have a decent send-off. I don't know why we never told our parents about this incident, but then my sister and I were never big talkers at the very best of times, and our parents really never knew what we got up to anyway. Fast forward to my late 20s, when after being a rookie for a few years, I eventually became a fully fledged snowcat operator, and by this time in my life, regretfully I had 2 failed marriages behind me, and was getting married for the 3rd and hopefully final time. My parents were despairing with me over my inability to keep my wives happy, and blamed me for the demise of both of my relationships. "You know what your problem is, darling? You're not giving your wives enough attention," my mother moaned at me. "You need to spoil them, and give them compliments once in a while." "What exactly do you mean?" I asked her. "Oh, Russ," my mother would groan, "did I not teach you anything growing up? You need to say things like, 'Darling, your hair looks so beautiful today, and I love your dress.'" "But what if I don't like her hair?" I said. "And what if I don't like her dress?" "Just say it," my mother snapped. "Even if you don't mean it, and if she asks you if her bum looks fat in her dress, for goodness sake make sure you say no, because no woman needs to hear the truth." "Why?" I asked. "Why would I lie to my wife?" "Because I say so, that's why," said my mother. And then she continued, "When did you last tell your wife that you loved her?" "Well, I told her once," I said. "Isn't that enough?" "No, it's not, darling," said my mother. "You need to say it often, Russ. Women need to feel loved. It's important to tell them that you love them often." She continued in her instruction. "You should occasionally buy your wife a fancy bouquet of flowers. Women love flowers. And chocolates, of course. Then occasionally take her out for a romantic candlelit dinner. You have to put some effort into your relationship, Russ, darling, because everything in life takes work. You know, Russ, what it's like when you're fixing the snow after the skiers have messed it up. It takes hours of work for you and that snowcat of yours to smooth out all their mess. It's the same with a marriage, she told me. It takes work, plenty of commitment, and lots of appreciation. I don't want to make excuses for myself, as my mother made some valid points, but I do think my job as a snow groomer had a great deal to do with the failure of my 2 former marriages, as both my wives felt that I was never around for them in the evening for that quintessential glass of white wine and a cosy dinner for 2, and even when I was around, I was never much of a talker. It would seem that being a poor communicator and a very contained person only caused my wives to become more embittered towards me. I have learnt that divorce is not uncommon among people working in the night shift, especially during the weekends when couples enjoy being social together, and both my wives were always on their own at social functions, and they hated feeling like a wallflower at these events. When most people pack up to return home after a heavy day at work, I'm invariably only just getting started. I really love and appreciate my job on the ski slopes as a snowcat operator, where I spend hours at a time with myself, listening to my stereo music, undoing what the skiers spent the day doing as they roughed up and messed up the ski slopes substantially, which is where using my snowcat comes into play. Over the years, I've learnt to skillfully and masterfully manoeuvre the snow from the slopes back uphill towards the centre of the trails. Then I resurface and refresh the snow, following all the grooming plans that I've been given for that particular night by my superior. I truly consider my job the most exciting, rewarding job in the world, because it really is like a sport in a manner of speaking. There are, of course, times when you get motion sickness from all the constant jerking around in the vehicle, and the swinging back and forth in the snowcat, which can, of course, induce feelings of nausea and queasiness. It is very stressful when visibility is not good, so over the years I've used the tree line as a reference point and guide. There have been times that I've actually slipped and skidded badly and literally fallen out of my cab, and that is not funny, I assure you. On those occasions I've literally had to drag myself out of the snow and get back into my snowcat, because there's no one to help you. It can be incredibly lonely out there, as you're all on your own. It's important not to be afraid of the blizzards or heavy wind conditions, as you have to operate the cat in all manner of conditions, so it's not for the faint-hearted, let me tell you. You have to learn the mountains you're grooming like the back of your hands, taking into account where you might have a sheer cliff face on one side and trees on another. and you cannot see a thing. Sometimes it's a little like driving a powerful vehicle blindfolded over treacherous, slippery and dangerous terrain. One evening I wasn't feeling at all well. I remember I had a throbbing headache, a sore throat, and was coughing quite a lot. I decided to take a medication that I didn't know at the time had sedative-like side effects. Not good when you're operating heavy machinery, I can assure you of that. I returned to my snowcat, which was covered in an ethereal blue glow from the full moon that night. As I began to groom the slope, I became increasingly disorientated and groggy, but instead of having the common sense to call it a day, I continued to groom the slopes, and at one point I got out of my cab to examine something on the ground. I could feel that my temperature was soaring, and although it was -2 outside, I was sweating like a pig. I got back into my cab and I saw the hazy, somewhat blurry silhouettes of two dark figures playing together in the snow, throwing snowballs at each other. They were running around and chasing each other, seemingly having the time of their lives, but it was 11 o'clock at night. I could hardly believe it. They were a fair distance away from me, so I couldn't see them very clearly, but I do remember thinking that no one should be playing on the slopes at this time of night, or messing up the snow like this for my snowcat to fix. I got out of my cab to have a better view of the two mysterious people, and due to my groggy, disorientated state, I really wasn't looking to where I was going, and I slipped, lost my balance, and went rolling and plummeting down the steep slope towards the two people like a massive lumbering dough ball, when finally I reached the bottom and came to a grinding halt. I could hear 2 feet racing towards me very fast, and I looked up to see 2 faces staring down at me that were clearly wondering what the strange thing was that had come tumbling down the hill at such an insane speed. The 2 critters that were checking me out possessed the same pyramid-like faces of the critter I'd encountered as a child. I was so stunned by what I was seeing that my eyes grew as round as saucers and my mouth dropped open. I don't know who was more bewildered, the critters or me. For a moment all 3 of us were locked in a stare, none of us quite knowing how to react to each other. I felt so drunk and intoxicated from the medication, but that did not impair the escalating terror rising up in my heart. I knew I was in the presence of 2 of the most intimidating, enormous critters that I have ever encountered in my entire life, and something dangerous and as threatening as a lion or a tiger, believe me. Without question, these critters were majestic, lofty, powerful, and exceedingly formidable. When you're face to face with something this colossal, you become judiciously aware of how small and vulnerable you are in the great scheme of things. I would say these critters were easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 feet across the shoulders, and they were covered in jet black long hair that was a little scant on the midsection, only serving to highlight the taut, powerful muscle definition beneath. I could see this clearly in the light of the full moon. The critters both possessed very powerful shoulders, overlong arms, and short, stocky legs, and their deep-set dark eyes reflected a very menacing red eye-shine. In my terror and desperate need to escape, it would seem that my ungainly body malfunctioned, while my brain kept screaming at me to run. The only way I can describe it to you, it was like my brain disengaged and misfired, and my faulty body failed to start up like an old rusty car engine. I became cloddish, uncoordinated and oafish. I tried to gain my composure, staggering precariously to my feet, but in my gallant, courageous, best efforts to manoeuvre my body efficiently off the ground, I slipped and lost my balance, not just once, but 3 more consecutive times. I believe my terror had stiffened and frozen my body like a large block of cement, and it didn't help that the woozy, sedative effects of my medication were fogging up my mind considerably. I could tell by the expressions on the critter's face that they thought I was exceedingly clumsy and graceless. I discerned that my uncoordinated staggering around the snow like an inebriated, sizzled and impaired drunk was a source of great amusement for them both. I promise you that those critters were snorting so much that I sensed that they were definitely laughing at me and having a joke at my expense. After a while, one critter began to feel desperately sorry for me. He gathered me in his overlong arms like a bird with a broken wing that he wanted to rescue, throwing me gently over his shoulders like a large sack of oranges, carrying me up the steep, precarious slope with effortless ease and with a seamless fluidity, without a single jolt, while his friend walked by his side, and they chatted merrily together like two people talking a strange language. Finally, the critter plonked me on the ground next to my snowcat. He then turned around with his friend, and it was like they were gliding as they moved away, with such an extraordinary grace down the steep slope. They swang their arms backwards and forwards. I watched them in awe for a long while from my snowcat, as they continued to throw snowballs at each other, seemingly unfazed by the fact that I could see them clearly. I kept thinking to myself, am I rarely seeing this, or is this the side effect of my cold medication playing tricks on me? The next few days at work, many of the snowcat operators were commenting about the large trails of human-like tracks seen all over the steep hills, and people were very floored about the size of these imprints that had messed up the snow. I kept my mouth shut and never said a single word about what I'd seen on the slopes. All these years later, I'm still grooming the snow in the late afternoon, after the slopes are closed once the skiers have left. There have been occasions I've sensed my snowcat being watched, or seen a large tree in the wood green suddenly taking on a human form and moving, and that's when I instinctively know I'm perceiving the critters that I now know to be Bigfoots. In truth, I'm glad they're out there watching over the slopes, as they've never given us any problems and seem benevolent and benign, although I must confess an encounter with one of these critters can be very spooky indeed. I'm glad to confess that I'm still married to wife number 3, who is not concerned by the strange hours I work, and one of the reasons I think my marriage actually works is my wife doesn't expect me to make her happy. She believes everyone is responsible for their own happiness, and I love the fact that she accepts me for who I am and doesn't expect me to be a huge talker. Instead, she enjoys talking and I love to listen, so our relationship really works. I've learnt to tell her I love her often, but I draw the line at pretending she looks good in a dress if she doesn't, and if her bum looks big, I'd probably tell her, so I'm not big on the lie thing. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Anka and I'm from the Bay Ridge neighbourhood, which is on the southwest corner of New York in the borough of Brooklyn, where I initially lived with my husband in a very attractive multi-unit red brick pre-war apartment, and this picturesque apartment was where I actually raised my 2 children when they were young, before they finally left home to begin lives of their own. My incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot encounter happened in rural Georgia in Gordon County on a holistic retreat of all things, quite simply the last place I would expect to encounter the elusive hairy man. My strange, incredulous, bizarre story begins when one day out of the blue, with no forward warning and no negative signs of anything being at all wrong, my husband of 28 years announced casually over the breakfast table in a nonchalant way with an air of indifference that he wanted a divorce. I remember I felt as if I'd been hit head-on by a forklift truck. It was as calamitous for me emotionally as any life-changing event invariably is, like a major car accident or a devastating tragedy. In an instant, my whole world came tumbling down like a building in the throes of demolition, one brick after another, leaving behind a whole heap of chaos. I was that heap of chaos. "Did you hear me?" piped my husband. "I want a divorce." I remember my hand began to wobble unsteadily on my cup of coffee, and I began to tremble. "But why?" I protested. "I don't understand. We've been together for almost 30 years and have raised 2 beautiful kids together. I thought we were both happy." "I'm in love with someone else," said my husband, "and I want to spend the rest of my life with her, and not with you. It's as simple as that." In that moment I was more than a little stunned. Why had I not seen this coming? Was there something I'd missed? Why had I not seen the warning signs that something was terribly wrong in our marriage? "Who is she?" I asked, holding my mug tightly in my hands, resisting the temptation of throwing the coffee directly into my husband's face to wipe the smug, self-satisfied, impervious look off his face. "Someone I met at the office," he chided. "We've been having an affair for over 4 months now, and one thing led to another." "4 months?" I gasped. "This has been going on for 4 months?" "I'm afraid so," said my husband in a nonchalant way, as if he was talking about the weather. I'll be sending you the divorce papers in due course, and I won't be coming back to the apartment any day soon, except to pick up some of my stuff." I watched in horrified disbelief and dismay as my aloof, impassive husband gathered his briefcase together and then bustled out of the house in a cavalier, heartless way, getting into his jeep and driving off into the sunset to embrace his new romantic life with his brand new love. How long I sat at that table, I do not know. I was in such a stunned daze. For a while I was frankly too numb and desensitized to feel anything at all. And then I became angry and enraged and began to beat the pillows on my bed so hard that my cat Garfield, who was decidedly unimpressed by my fragile state, wisely decided to make a quick, hasty retreat from the bedroom, eyeing me warily, as if to say, "What's got into you?" For several long days I remained in my pyjamas, and I slumped around the house clutching my pillow desperately, like a frightened kid with a teddy bear. There were times I lay on my bed on a crumpled, despairing heap, and sobbed until I physically could not cry any more tears, as they had completely dried up. I do not even know how to describe my emotional turmoil to you, as my feelings lay all around my mind like the scattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and I was powerless to put the pieces together again. How could this have happened, I wondered? How could our marriage of 28 years be over now? How could my husband decide all of a sudden he didn't love me anymore? None of this made any sense at all. How could you just switch off your emotions like a tap and cease to care about someone anymore? I then began to ask myself all kinds of questions about my husband's mysterious lover. Who on earth was she? Was she much younger than I was? Was she prettier than me, I wondered. All those disturbing, tormenting thoughts whirled around in my mind like the flying pieces of laundry in a tumble-dryer. Then I knew immediately that I simply had to find out what she looked like to satisfy my heightened curiosity. So that very afternoon, still wearing my pyjamas, I got into the car and waited outside the offices where my husband worked. That was when I saw them, arm in arm, walking out of the offices together, both laughing happily and staring lovingly into each other's eyes like besotted teenagers. I gasped in astonishment. My husband's new woman was my age and was not even remotely attractive. I think the fact that she was so plain hit me harder than if she'd been young and beautiful, because I remember thinking, "You left me for her." I think I was exceedingly insulted and even offended. The only thing I could conclude was that she must have one hell of a personality. For the next month I barely ate, avoided phone calls, and stayed at home taking unpaid leave from my job. There were times I felt so inadequate, dejected, despairing and hopeless that I even considered swallowing a whole bunch of pills and just ending it all. One evening my husband popped around to pick up some of his stuff, as he had said he would. "Look at you," he gasped. "You look frightful. You're a complete mess." He said this in such a cold-blooded, compassionless way, and then I watched him gathering his clothes together and leaving the house without even batting an eyelid. That was when it hit me like a bolt of lightning. You were married to this soulless, remorseless man for over 28 long years, and he doesn't give a toss about you. Why on earth are you wasting and expending all your time and energy crying over such a narcissistic creep? That was when common sense and wisdom prevailed, and I finally pulled myself together like the cords of a washbag. "You idiot," I scolded myself. "You think he cares a damn about you? Of course not. You're sitting back grieving over a complete jerk. What is your problem, woman? Get a grip." That was when I decided to book myself into a holistic retreat for a couple of weeks, as it was a marvellous place where people could receive emotional, mental and physical healing in the Georgia countryside. I knew getting away from New York would be exceedingly therapeutic for me. I had heard about this incredible place from a friend of mine who described the retreat as a lifesaver for her after her father had tragically passed away. I remember she returned from that retreat so radiant and full of life. I knew this was the kind of place that would indeed help me to get back on my feet. Within a day or so I had arrived at this perfect retreat, which was an exquisite white Georgian home, surrounded by verdant valleys, open prairies of wild flowers, silvery streams, pond, rugged mountainous outcrops, and dreamy forests. There was about 8 of us women on the retreat, and a handful of experts who were helping us through our turbulent journey of holistic healing. There was also a dietitian, a massage therapist, a counsellor, and so much more. I was to discover that the troubled women at the retreat were there with all kinds of personal problems, from low self-esteem, addiction, depression, and so much more. And many of those issues arose from fractured or abusive relationships from their pasts. It was a radical treatment where we were given daily coffee enemas, drinking vegetable juices every 2 hours, experiencing rigorous massages, and exposed to counselling sessions where we talked about our problems and grievances. We even engaged in bizarre rituals to come to terms with our past that sometimes seemed to border on the ridiculous, but as odd and as crazy as it sounds, they actually seemed to work. I remember the one day I was actually asked to punch this large punching bag where a picture of my husband's face was attached to the bag with a pair of boxing gloves. I was asked to pretend that this bag was my husband. "I want you to show your husband how he has made you feel," the therapist told me. "Express those feelings locked within you as you punch the bag. Hit it as hard as you like. Release all that pent-up emotion inside of you." "You're a real turd," I said, beating the bag. "How dare you treat me like a piece of dirt?" I beat the bag again. "I despise what you did. You made me feel like I was worthless. You broke my heart." I promise you that I beat that bag within an inch of its life, and I felt so much better for it. The coffee enemas were another radical, unorthodox treatment that turned out to have extraordinary health-giving benefits that I could have never envisaged possible. As gruesome as it appeared, I was amazed by this ancient method of detoxification, and the putrid stuff that came out of my colon, like colon plaque, worms, and undigested food that gets trapped in there for many years, was so uplifting. It would seem that this purging and cleansing of the body was exceedingly regenerating and restorative for me. We were informed that in order to heal, we needed to cleanse, detoxify, and regenerate our minds, bodies, and spirits. And as idiosyncratic and unconventional as it sounds, it was miraculously beginning to work for me. I was feeling lighter, almost as if a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. My skin was beginning to glow and radiate, and suddenly I could see a light at the end of the tunnel of my life, as it became brighter and richer in quality. Every morning we would engage in very restful yoga sessions with deep breathing on the pristine velvety lawn, which was situated only yards away from a very tranquil, beautiful forest that consisted of statuesque pine, cedar, and oak trees. One day as I was lying back on my mat, I was sure I discerned that we were being watched. It was the weirdest feeling ever, but I knew in my gut that someone or something was hiding behind the large oak tree, watching our every move, like a perverse peeping Tom of some kind. I did not express my misgivings to anyone, as no one appeared to notice or sense anything. Was I losing my mind, I wondered? Had I imagined what I perceived? I could have sworn that someone had been watching us, but why had I been the only one to sense this anomaly? As we trooped over to the table to receive our wheatgrass shots, the whole pitcher of green juice was now all empty. We looked at each other in amazement, for none of us had drunk our servings of the grotesque drink yet. The therapist looked confused. "What happened to all the wheatgrass?" she asked. No one could answer this curious enigma, and so she returned from the kitchen with another pitcher of juice. I got the sense that she thought that one of us was secretly drinking all the wheatgrass behind her back. Her eyes kept glancing towards Nancy. One of the clients had had addictions to just about everything. "It wasn't me," protested Nancy, looking at the therapist earnestly. "I don't even like the stuff." I could tell that the therapist didn't look convinced, but thankfully she said nothing. Later that day, when we were given free time, either to go for a walk or take a nap or read a book, I decided to venture into the Sylvan. That seemed to be mysteriously calling me, for some reason. Words fail me to describe how exquisite this area of woodland really was, and I did wonder why no one in our group had shown any interest in exploring this enchanting spot, or just going for a walk. It's so steep in those woods, one of the ladies had informed me. I loathe walking uphill. I want to assure you that I was in wondrous awe of what I was perceiving. The tall, statuous, mature trees with their ample, burly trunks rose up into the heavens like masterful giants, and the branches intertwined from a great height, providing a glorious canopy above my head, while the sunlight twinkled through the branches and bespeckled the floor in a subtle ethereal light that created a quintessential magical ambience. There were lavish curtains of ravishing verdant moss, swathing the branches in velvet green carpets, and even rocky outcrops were dappled with this green, fairy, magical dust. Then amidst the sculptural rocks were fanned out lacy ferns, wild violets, creeping junipers and periwinkles, and so much cascading greenery of which I could not identify. I noted that the forest became steeper as I climbed ever onwards and upwards on the hilly rocky incline, where the rugged earthen trail zigzagged precariously through this woodland stretch, supported by naturally formed rock walls that provided stability for the steep ascent. I could hear the pretty tweets and warbles of the songbirds, and noisy yet soothing crashing sounds of the water from the stream that meandered through the valley below. Before long the ground evened out, and I was on a flat expanse, and as I moved ever forward, once again I sensed that I was being watched. It was not a pleasant feeling, and I wondered if the peeping Tom from our yoga sessions was hiding out here in the woods and spying on me. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on edge, and I knew I needed to head right back because something was distinctly off. As I clambered down the rocky paths, I sensed the creep behind me and could hear his heavy breathing. If that wasn't bad enough, this creepy stalker was following me closely and was clueless to my awareness of his presence. I was terrified that he was going to emerge from the undergrowth and pounce upon me. My imagination perceived that this weirdo may be some kind of psychotic killer. I'd seen enough programs on televisions about strange men hiding out in woods and attacking unsuspecting targets. I did not want to be another victim. I walked slowly, and as I moved, so did this man, and when I stopped, so did he. I turned around, briefly scanning the area with my eyes, but I saw nothing. It made no sense to me. My mind was racing. Should I run? Should I walk? Should I call out to the stranger and let him know that I was fully aware of his presence? I reached out to retrieve a stick from the ground and began thrashing it as I walked. This way I would show the creep that I was not going down without a fight. I whipped the ground very hard, and the stranger behind me began to flog the ground. I was stunned that this man had the audacity and the nerve to mimic my movements. Finally I'd had quite enough, and I spoke out. "Come out! I know you're there, and I know you're following me. Show yourself now." The forest grew strangely silent, almost airily still, and I heard nothing. But instead of walking forwards, I turned around and began to look behind the trees. I was not going to let someone get the upper hand, I thought angrily. Suddenly the bold, courageous, valiant warrior within me surfaced, the fighter that had been suppressed and hijacked for so long by a subservience that had monopolized and controlled me during my married life. I had forgotten that in my core I was tough, strong, and determined, and there was a side in me that I had long since forgotten, that was being reawakened and energized. "I know you're there," I called out, wagging the stick in my hand forcefully, "and I'm not taking any nonsense from you." All of a sudden I saw a movement, and then I saw him. I knew at once that he was the mythical creature known as Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. I have no way of describing what I felt at this moment, as astonishment completely overwhelmed my sense of understanding, and completely subdued and repressed any feelings of fear that I might have had. I was so gobsmacked that I just stood there staring at this critter in total and utter disbelief, with my mouth hanging open and my eyes growing as wide as saucers. What I was perceiving seemed so illusionary and so way out of the realms of our reality that for a moment I needed to pinch myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. as this experience was so surreal and phantasmic. The Bigfoot was about 7 foot tall, 500 pounds, and 3 foot wide across the shoulders, and was slender but burly in its width, with very overlong arms and powerful, taut, muscular legs. The critter was covered with long, flowing, light brown hair. I noted that the dome-shaped head of the critter appeared to seamlessly fold into the shoulders. It didn't have a neck to speak of. The face was exceedingly boyish, with a very prominent brow ridge, very flat, wide nose, and deep-set green-brown mischievous eyes. But what amazed me the most was that the critter was so human-like, it was almost unfathomable. For a second the Bigfoot began to mimic what I had been doing moments earlier by lashing the ground with a stick. I just stood there watching him emulate my previous actions, just too bewildered and stunned to even respond. The Bigfoot pointed to my stick with a rarely naughty twinkle in his eyes, and I realised he wanted me to thrash the ground, like I'd done so before, as if we were playing some weird kind of game. For some reason of which I cannot fathom, I obliged him. As the mischievous spark in his eyes, I did not desire to refuse, so I horsewhipped the ground, and then it was his turn, and he began to lash the ground with his stick, and this cycle of lashing the ground went on for a long while, like one of my therapy sessions, and then we both began to laugh. I think his laughter was more like a snort, but I could tell he was highly amused, and really enjoying our game immeasurably, and in a strange way, I was also having a great deal of fun. All of a sudden I heard this high-pitched whistle coming from further away, and the critter perked up, and I could visibly see a very disappointed expression upon his face, as he didn't want to leave our game, but someone was clearly calling him. The critter looked into my eyes, made a chattering sound of a few words, pointed to the woods with his overlong arms, as if to say that he needed to go, and disappointed I watched him glide into the woods so fast, like a rocket going off. I have never seen anything move that quickly in my life. When I returned back to the retreat, I told no one what I'd seen, but I thought about that Bigfoot all the time, and he made me smile. In the days that followed, I could sense during our yoga practice that we were indeed being watched, and I guessed that it was the curious, very inquisitive Bigfoot that I had encountered in the woods. This was confirmed during our session, when during every yoga practice 3 acorns were thrown directly at me, and I would giggle and wave towards the wood green and throw 3 acorns directly back at him. I knew he was saying, "Hello there." I now emphatically believe that the Bigfoot I encountered was actually a juvenile who had a taste for wheatgrass. It would seem the pitcher of green juice was always emptied, and I'm pretty certain the Bigfoot was the perpetrator of this mysterious crime, but I never said a word. I was hardly going to give my hairy friend away. I even heard the therapist on the phone calling up the kitchen. I'm afraid Nancy's been at it again, although she's not coming clean. But I know it's due to her addiction problem. She has it worse than I thought, and she's clearly still in denial. Can you send another pitcher of wheatgrass to the table, please? Fast forward a few weeks, and I returned to my home in New York, and for the first time in my life I felt energized and refreshed. I really believe my strange, rather bizarre encounter with a Bigfoot brought out the fighter within me that had been vanquished for so very long. I began to approach life very differently, with a renewed spirit and a sense of purpose, and I would wake up feeling very happy with my life. One day my husband came to visit me and begged me to take him back. I could not believe his blatant audacity. He had thrown me to the wolves, and now he wanted me back. That was never going to happen. "You dumped me," I reminded him, "not the other way round." "It was a mistake," he told me, "a big mistake." "You said you were in love with a woman and wanted to spend the rest of your life with her, and you didn't care a jot about how that made me feel at the time. You were brutally insensitive and callously cruel." "I was just infatuated," he explained. "It wasn't love. I thought it was, but I was confused." "I don't care what it was," I told him. "I was married to you for over 28 years, and I don't want to waste another minute of my time with you. When you walked out, you showed me what a spineless loser you really are. I want nothing more to do with you, but the divorce papers would be very nice, thank you very much." My husband looked completely startled. "But why? I don't understand. We were together for 28 years. You don't want me back?" "That's what I told you when you left me," I reminded him. "And no, I don't want you back. It's definitely over." My husband looked so shocked. "You really have grown cold and hard," he said. "It's called getting a backbone. I'm not a doormat anymore," I told him. I watched him storm out, and that was the last time I ever saw him. I heard he lives on his own now, with a shepherd dog, and people say he looks miserable and lonely. All these years later, I'm a very happy woman, and although I've never remarried, my life is incredibly full. And I do believe that Bigfoot that I encountered sparked a renewed fighting spirit within me. I have listened to all kinds of Bigfoot reports, but I am glad to say mine was more on the congenial side. But I can see why many people would be terrified of the critters, because they look fearsome and intimidating. In my case, I was just simply too shocked to be afraid. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rachel, and I'm from North Carolina, which is a beautiful, picturesque part of the world, known for its scenic vistas, majestic mountains to the west, pristine beaches to the east, and shorelines that stretch out for many miles, not to mention the most bedazzling golden sunsets that you've ever seen in your life. I grew up in the 1980s in a rather dilapidated mobile home, situated on a sizable, forlorn-looking farmer's field, dotted with about 30 other shoddy mobile homes, none of which were in the best condition, due to the owners not being endowed with full pockets, as all of the residents were incredibly poor and impoverished. I was raised in this insalubrious, shabby, rather ramshackled mobile home with my mother and my sister Ruth. Growing up, Ruth and I had absolutely no idea who our father actually was, but my mother was so promiscuous I don't doubt that she didn't know either. Ruth and I suspected that we were only half-sisters, and later through DNA tests this was indeed proven to be true, as I was the one with Cherokee lineage, while my sister's genealogy could be traced back to both Spain and Portugal. Growing up, my mother never cared about either of us. Her life was focused primarily on beer and cigarettes. I think at one time she may have actually been an attractive woman, possibly even pretty, but not any more. She had long, dull, ragtail blonde hair, haggard yellow skin, shrunken cheeks, and dark shadows under her puffy red eyes. She was skinny and emaciated, and that wasn't surprising, given that she only dined on liquid lunches that consisted primarily of beer morning, noon and night, as she barely ate a thing, for solid food, it would seem, was of little interest to her. I always remember her going to the store with a big trolley in her hands and filling it up with beers and packets of cigarettes. She would then remember us as an afterthought and begrudgingly toss a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and jam into the trolley. Very often as young children we would go hungry, so we would amble over to Mrs. Rivers' mobile home and ask her if she had a bite for us to eat. Old Mrs. Rivers was a kind elderly lady. She was eager to put food into our hungry bellies, and she would plate us up large portions of macaroni cheese or meatloaf, and it's thanks to her my sister and I actually got to eat. I remember she was never afraid to tell my mother what she thought of her. "You're a waste of space, Nellie," she would shout. "You need to feed those children of yours instead of your belly with all those beers. Growing children need nutrients and vitamins. You should be ashamed of yourself." My mother, holding a drink of beer in one hand and a cigarette in another, would spit on the ground at Mrs. Rivers in contempt and make her way back to the trailer. It was common to find my mother with a new man 3 or 4 times a week, usually in the evenings. The next morning the mysterious stranger would be gone, and my mother would be lying passed out on the couch, nursing a huge hangover. At the time I never questioned my mother's sordid, licentious lifestyle, because I never knew any better. But when she was entertaining her male friends, we would sit back watching television in the trailer, and it could get quite lonely at times. We would often hear her laughing away in the bedroom, and she always sounded so sozzled. How my sister and I longed to have a relationship with my mother, but she never talked to us much. She treated us with disdain and disinterest, almost as if we were a nuisance in her life, and so there was no love lost between us. On one occasion my mother went away for an entire weekend, abandoning us in the trailer, and it was Mrs. Rivers who took us under her wing. "I'm not a snitch," she would say to us, But if I was a tattletale, I would report that mother of yours to a Child Protective Services. How can she just bugger off into the sunset like this, without giving you kids a second thought? The mind boggles that a woman like this should even be permitted or allowed to have kids. Your mother barely knows how to look after herself, let alone be responsible for you. It's such a dreadful shame. At the rear of our trailer park, there was a large forest that stretched back for many miles, and as kids we longed to play there, but we had been warned by old Mrs. Rivers that the craggy monster lived there, and that he was to be left alone at all times, as he was mean and volatile, and had a very bad temper. My sister and I had no idea what the craggy monster was, and we asked my mother about it occasionally, and she laughed and told us that there was no such thing as the craggy monster. That Mrs. Rivers is filling your head with stuff and nonsense. Don't believe a thing that old mare has to say. She does talk complete and utter hogwash. Do you know she even believes in the fae? What's the fae? I asked. She believes in fairies, my mother chuckled. Now anyone who believes in fairies is a serious head case. One day my sister and I overcame our reticent fear of the grove, as curiosity got the better of us, and so in a moment of impulsive curiosity we decided to explore the woods. Maybe my mother was right, and there was no such thing as the craggy monster. But little did we know we were to find out very differently. When we entered the woods we were so overwhelmed by its beauty. It was a world away from the farmer's field and all of its dilapidated ugly trailers. It was serene and peaceful, with pretty birdsong and magnificent tall trees that were swathed in resplendent curtains of velvety green moss, and were so tall that the branches were as high as a 6-story building. I loved the way the branches interweaved into each other, forming a huge umbrella above our heads, allowing prisms of pretty light to dance onto the forest floor, dappling it in an ethereal, subtle light. The large statuesque grove of trees rose up masterfully upon an elevated, rugged and craggy hilly incline, which was scattered liberally with sculptural rocks, many of them bespeckled with green moss. The pebbly ground was dotted with very frilly ferns and pretty ground covers that grew up between the rocky mounds like rambunctious weeds. The cherry on the cake for us was a pretty little silvery stream, scattered with smooth river pebbles and large shapely boulders that zigzagged through the valley. Ruth and I were beginning to think that old Mrs. Rivers' story about the craggy monster was just a made-up fantasy. It did not seem possible that something big, ugly, cantankerous and dangerous could live in this idyllic, extremely glorious spot. But as we trekked further into the woods, the ambience began to change considerably. Soon we saw no sightings of squirrels or chipmunks darting up trees, nor did we hear any pretty bird song. In fact, on the contrary, not to put too fine a point on it, the place seemed deathly quiet and exceedingly unsettling, so much so that the hair on the back of my neck stood up on end, and I began to feel distinctly unsettled and discomposed, as something just did not feel right. If that wasn't bad enough, I began to get a very distinct, airy impression that we were being watched, but when I looked around the immediate area, I saw nothing. "I think we should get out of here, Ruth," I told my sister. "I'm feeling rather scared." "So am I," said my sister. "Something is watching us. Can you see it? It's over there." My sister pointed to an area where there were some young tree saplings that looked like they were swaying backwards and forwards on their own accord, but you could see that this was not the case. I could see the ominous, hazy outline of a very dark, formidable-looking silhouette moving between the trees. Then we heard the most god-awful, terrifying, low guttural growl that was so petrifying I became incapacitated by fear. I will never ever forget how my body reacted to that sound, as it reverberated through my chest like a heavy beating drum, serving only to completely incapacitate me. So instead of running away, I was frozen to the spot, trembling and shaking violently. My heart was beating rapidly in my chest, and I felt vulnerable, like a bird ensnared by a cat. Then we saw it, as it thundered towards us on its long, powerful, muscular legs, like a rhino in full charge. I could not believe what I was discerning, and I knew at once it was the craggy monster. Truly, It was like seeing a monster from the world of myths, legends, and fictitious stories slip into our reality and take on bodily form, for indeed it did not belong to our earthly realm. The critter was possibly the most ugliest, grotesque, hideous, repugnant, and scariest thing I have ever beheld. He was shaped like a man, but he was not a man. And there were aspects to his appearance that reminded me of an ape, but he was not an ape, for indeed he was neither one nor the other. Moreover, he was a combination of both. This colossal critter of note was taller than our trailer door, and wider, with overlong arms and a substantial pyramid-shaped head that folded seamlessly into the most humongous broad shoulders that I have ever beheld. This diabolical, fiendish critter was covered in long, matted, dark black hair that was blacker than a raven's feathers, and his deep-set, soulless dark eyes were malicious, malevolent, cold, and callous. I could sense that this iniquitous, duplicitous critter did not want us in the wood grove, for he was incandescent with rage, and began to chase after us in his rage, which was so tangible I could feel it like a physical sensation. I'm glad to say that I was able to run that day, like the wind. I ran as I have never run before in my life, nor will I ever run like that again. But I raced through the woods at a speed even I did not know I was capable of. We could hear this horrendous creature trailing behind us, and even feel his hot breath breathing on the back of our necks, and it smelt so foul, like rotten fish or decaying flesh, and he breathed heavily as he ran behind us, sounding like a horse. Ruth and I finally managed to race through the farmer's field and get to our trailer as quickly as we could, slamming the door behind us violently. Once in safety, we tried to calm down, and our breathing softened in intensity, and then we peered cautiously through the window, and there we saw the large critter standing at the edge of the tree line, stomping his feet and banging his chest in savage defiance. We could feel him scrutinizing us from afar through his sadistic, evil eyes, as if he was boring through the very depths of our soul. He stood there like a solid tree trunk, motionless like a statue for a long while, but we were heartily relieved that he never ventured further towards the field. My sister and I were so scared, but we never told anyone for fear of getting into trouble. We knew that no one in the trailer homes ventured into the wood grove. Now we knew why, for we had seen the craggy monster for ourselves, and knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was indeed real. I will never forget the night that followed as long as I live, because between the hours of 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, the craggy monster came into the field and began thrashing, beating, and shaking all the mobile homes so that they actually wobbled and vibrated in an act of delinquency and insubordination, possibly to show how aggrieved he actually was that 2 of us had actually dared to venture into the wood grove. We could hear the critter snorting, grunting, and banging his chest, and he was roaring so loudly that some of the people in the mobile homes began to scream out in terror, and one of the residents started shooting out a round of bullets from his rifle into the air, but it did little to subdue the critter, who was intent on scaring everyone half to death. I remember the critter shook our whole mobile home, and my sister and I were shaking in terror and crying so much. We were so overwhelmed with fear. We were convinced the craggy monster was going to prize us out of our home like sardines from a tin can, because, believe me, if he had wanted to unleash the full extent of his wrath, I might not be alive today to share my story with you. As you can imagine, my mother never noticed a single thing on that fateful night in question. She was in one of her drunken comas, and despite the precarious wobbling of our mobile home, she was so inebriated she barely noticed a single thing. The next morning Mrs. Rivers was less than pleased with the both of us, and gave us a staunch telling off, because she knew the previous night's events, and the angry attack on our mobile home was because someone had dared to venture into the craggy monster's territory, and she guessed it was us kids up to no good. "You went into the wood grove, didn't you?" We hung our heads in shame and nodded. "I told you to leave the craggy monster alone. The woodgrove is his territory. We need to respect that. You're lucky he didn't make an example of the both of you. You could have both been killed. Do you realise that? Is he going to come back again tonight? I asked, growing incredibly alarmed. It's unlikely, said Mrs. Rivers. The craggy monster was making a statement. He was re-establishing his boundaries, making sure we fully understand and respect that the woodgrove belongs to him. Provided we respect and understand that, he will leave us alone. Thankfully, in the weeks and months that followed, they were uneventful, and Ruth and I stayed well clear of the woodgrove, always mindful of the dreadful beast that lived within its midst. However, that all changed one night when my mother, who was rather tipsy at the time, brought home a man called Rolf that she'd been seeing for a long while, for a romantic rendezvous. I could tell that my mother really liked Rolf. She behaved very differently with him, and seemed so drawn to him, beyond just physical attraction. Rolf and my mother were behaving like a couple of lovebirds, and were staring into each other's eyes like besotted puppy dogs. In a gesture of romantic indulgence, Rolf had actually brought a huge basket along with him, full of all kinds of delicious goodies, including a bottle of champagne and a large folded-up picnic rug. This never happened, so I knew this man was rather smitten with my mother, as he treated her like a princess, and brought her generous gifts of flowers, chocolates, and expensive perfume. From what I'd learnt, Rolf was a long-distance lorry driver who was looking for a lot more out of life than just a ruffle in the hay. Most of the men my mother encountered never respected or honoured her, but just used her like a worn-out old slipper for a random night of passion, and never was seen or heard from again. But Rolf was exceedingly different. I could tell he genuinely liked and warmed to my mother, and I was sincerely happy for her, because despite everything, she deserved some happiness, and she was still my mother after all. "Let's go and have a picnic in the woods," Rolf suggested to my mother. "It'll be romantic there. It's a full moon. We'll be able to see clearly, and I've got lots of champagne for us." "I love the idea," said my mother. "Let's go." "Can't you take Mummy somewhere else?" I begged. "The craggy monster lives in the woods, and he's really horrible." Rolf let out a loud, deep-throaty laugh. "The craggy monster lives in the woods," he repeated. "You have quite the imagination on you, haven't you, girl? It's quite enchanting, really." "But it's true," insisted my sister Ruth. "The craggy monster is real." Rolf shuffled around in his pocket and handed me a large bunch of cash. "I tell you what," he said. "Why don't you kids order yourselves some pizza and ice cream, while your mother and I go and enjoy an undisturbed, peaceful picnic in the woods under the stars? Did you hear what I said, kids? Undisturbed." It was clear that Mother and Rolf were not going to listen to our warnings, despite my very best efforts, because I knew that the craggy monster was real, but they were clearly not believing me about that. I could tell that Rolf thought I was a silly little kid with an overactive imagination, and it was no use convincing him otherwise. So reluctantly, taking a large metal pole with me to fight off the monster, I gallantly ventured into the woods. Ruth was too terrified to accompany me on this mission, and begged me not to go, but I refused to listen to her. I was obstinate and stubborn at the very best of times. I honestly do not know what I was thinking at the time. I guess I believed that if the critter did attack my mother, I would be able to defend her. I mean, I was only 13, but I fancied myself as some kind of a hero. If I did manage to rescue my mother from a dangerous predator, maybe she would love me more. Maybe she would pay me a little bit more attention, for I longed for her love. I longed for her approval and validation. Never once in my young life had she ever told me that she loved me. Maybe after my bravery tonight, my mother would perceive me very differently. So summoning up all the courage that I could muster, and grasping the heavy iron pole within my hand, I hid behind a tree, and was so glad to see that my mother and Rolf were seated in a clearing close to the trees that fringed the grove. I was exceedingly hopeful that the craggy monster would not even know that my mother or Rolf was actually there. You could hear the chorus of crickets and frogs, and the night seemed unadulterated by anything insidious or untoward. It was an enchanting, bewitching, beautiful evening, and the moonlight on the edge of the tree line was magical as it filtered through the wood grove with an ethereal luminosity, and that, combined with the light of Rolf's torch, enabled the visibility to be remarkably good that evening. Before long my mother was drinking champagne with Rolf, and they were giggling and laughing together. All of a sudden I could hear the sound of heavy feet thundering through the trees, and it truly sounded like a rhino in the thicket, and not a happy one either. Then we saw the ruthless critter. He was standing yards away from Rolf and my mother, and his nostrils were flaring, and he was growling at the couple with merciless, menacing eyes that became as red and as bright and demonic as traffic lights. I could see Rolf and my mother looking so astonished and bemused by what they were perceiving. Their eyes became as round as saucers, and their mouths were so astonished they were hanging open. They looked as frozen and fixed in time, like a couple of wax statues from Madame Tussauds. The licentious creature rolled back his lips to expose these oversized human teeth, and he began to growl much like a dog guarding a bone. Only this growl was much more aligned with that of a menacing great beast, like a tiger or a lion. "Run!" screamed Ralph, trying to pull my mother up from her seated position. But as he dragged her up with his strong arms, she staggered backwards clumsily, due to her intoxicated state. She just couldn't stand straight, let alone even begin to run. The best thing she could do was manage an awkward stumble, and then she fell backwards onto the ground again. I was hiding behind the tree, shaking so much like a jelly, and I wanted to defend my mother. Believe me, I did, with everything I could, but my courage just dissipated and was vanquished from me in a single instant, only to be hijacked and overtaken by an overwhelming terror that gripped every part of my being. I could feel the warm water dripping down my legs, and I realized in horror and shame that I'd actually wet myself. My heart was pounding in my chest, loudly and fast, so much so that I could hear every single beat. In all my born days, I don't think I've ever felt terror like that before, and I now know what it's like to feel hunted. The immoral critter ran directly towards my mother. Rolf, in his terror, scurried away, much like a frightened rabbit. This monstrous, heinous beast grabbed my mother by the back of her legs, so that she was hanging upside down in his overlong arms. He began to thrash my mother's body violently against a tree trunk, and I could hear all her bones crack. I knew she was dead after the very first blow, but the critter beat her so hard that her body began to fall apart as fingers and hands and pieces of flesh scattered everywhere like blobs of jelly, skin and bone. The critter violently scattered the picnic basket all over the grove in an angry rage, and upon discovering some interesting food items lying on the ground, his anger immediately subsided, and his mood lifted, and he hastily gathered the fruit and the other goodies into the basket and glided into the depths of the wood, no longer to be seen. I sat there behind the tree, frozen to the spot, unable to move, and then finally I made an escape, back to the mobile home where my sister was waiting for me. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and much had transpired. It would seem that the police had frequented the entire area, but the craggy monster was no longer to be found, although I gather that Rolf had informed the police that my mother had been mauled by a bear. But he knew that that was not the truth, and so did I. The medical examiner described my mother's death as a tragic, savage killing from a bear or other wild animal, and we were to learn that her liver was the consistency of butter, as it was so badly impaired by her alcoholic diet. We were informed by the medical examiner that my mother would have not survived past 6 months due to her exceedingly poor health. The police connected with my grandmother, whom had been looking for us for many years. She did not trust my mother's charge over us. We moved into her beautiful home, which was a world away from our home in the trailer park, where we were sent to great schools and proceeded to live affluent lives, which was quite a transformation. All these years later, I know that the critter that the residents of the trailer park called the craggy monster was in fact a Bigfoot. I look upon the memory of my mother with deep sadness and regret, because although I lived with her for 13 years of my life, I never really knew her, and she made no secret that my sister and I were a deep inconvenience to her. I really think her love of alcohol literally destroyed the very fabric and essence of her life and who she actually was. I'm glad to say that Ruth and I found love with my grandmother, who became like the mother that we never had. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Mariette, and I'm from the tree-covered Appalachian Mountain state of West Virginia, where I grew up in Charleston in the Goose Creek Reservoir area, and my story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1984 on my cousin's farm in West Virginia, where they grew corn. Growing up, I had two very loving cousins, Evelyn and Aubrey, who were close in age to me, and so at any given opportunity I would spend weekends and school holidays with them, as they were like sisters to me, and I was an only child, so it made sense. My easygoing aunt and uncle were the type of people that took life in their stride, so much so, in fact, that if something peculiar happened, they would invariably just shrug their shoulders in a nonchalant, unflustered way and say, well, strange things happen, and they would invariably just accept it as one of the anomalies or absurdities of life, of which no answers could ever be found. My aunt was a sensational baker and would create the most scrumptious melt-in-the-mouth baked goods, and her homely kitchen would always smell of baked bread, cinnamon and apple, or melted cheese. It was normal for her to bake several apple pies all at once and leave them out on the patio to cool down, and one or two of these apple pies would always go missing every single time, and later the glass dish would reappear with a river stone in it or a feather. My aunt would furrow her brow for a moment and looked positively puzzled, and then she would shrug her shoulders and say, "Oh, well, someone enjoyed my apple pie, but at least they had the decency to return my container." This enigmatic peculiarity would happen all the time, but my aunt never batted an eyelid, and always cooked more than she needed, as loaves of bread, cinnamon buns, and pecan pies would invariably go missing, only to be replaced by river stones, feathers, or bird nests. My aunt and uncle lived in the most idyllic, dreamy two-storey farmhouse with whitewashed walls and very large French windows overlooking the most splendiferous panoramic views. For indeed this quaint farmhouse looked so picturesque and charming, tucked in the middle of the undulating green valley, dotted with statuesque tall trees, silvery ponds, and pretty streams. On the one side of this enchanting farmhouse were fields of corn that would sway and dance in the wind. On the other side was what I can only describe as an evergreen wonderland, with pretty white-poled fencing, dappled white and brown horses galloping in the fields, a modern stable block, and a couple of pretty quaint-looking barns, with red roofs alongside a couple of fields dotted with pretty wild flowers, and a large white gravel road that was neatly hedged with lavender bushes and white daisies that led directly to the farmhouse. When I reflect back to those whimsical, nostalgic bygone days of my childhood, and those gloriously sunny, lackadaisical times spent at my aunt's farmhouse, drinking homemade lemonade and tucking into her delicious cinnamon buns, I do recall times when strange things arose that most certainly pointed towards Bigfoot activity, but in those days no one had ever heard of Bigfoot before. My aunt and uncle were amiable and carefree at the very best of times, so they paid very little attention to some of the oddities that occurred around the farm, but I most certainly did not. As a young child, my cousins and I would spend copious amounts of time in the woods, as indeed it was so beautiful to hang out in such an idyllic, exquisite place. For me, the woods were like our secret garden, away from the prying eyes of our parents, where we would play hide-and-seek and tag, as well as recklessly climb up trees and play by the pebbly stream that meandered through the valley with a soft flowing current. The woods were so exquisitely enchanting and alive, even magical is the word that I would use. They consisted primarily of towering oaks, maples and cherry trees, and the whole area was shaded by a huge parasol of intertwining leaves and branches, where light twinkled through the foliage, bespeckling the forest floor in a subtle luminescence that was almost ethereal. The shapely branches were draped in a verdant, velvety moss, and the ground was dotted with frilly ferns, wild ginger, wild strawberry, as well as wood asters. We would frequently see cottontail rabbits hopping around, as well as red and grey squirrels, and the occasional chipmunk darting up and down the trees. I do vividly remember when the woods would grow ominously quiet, inauspicious and oppressive. The bird song would just suddenly decrease until it vanished completely, and it became so airily quiet. We would also get this overwhelming, portentous and baleful inkling that something or someone was watching us, and the feeling was so menacious and discomposing that it would cause our hair to stand on end. It was like a foreboding impression of impending dread that would appropriate our sense of calm. Worse still, when this happened, an odorous rank smell that reminded me of hot garbage would linger over the whole region, and we would abandon our games forthwith and flee back to the farmhouse as fast as we could, filled with an enigmatic terror. My aunt would look at us in surprise and ask why we all appeared so startled and bewildered, but we never ever shared with her our peculiar feelings, for we knew she would dismiss our strange episode out of hand in the woods as down to a highly overactive imagination. I also remember a time when my cousin Aubrey, who was exceedingly forgetful, returned home from school once and accidentally left her satchel in the backyard overnight. She had left her untouched peanut butter and jelly sandwiches inside the Tupperware lunch container, and when the satchel was finally brought back into the house the following day, and the sealed container opened, the sandwiches were missing, and in their place was a river stone. We were so surprised to find the stone there, but my aunt just laughed and said that someone out there had a great sense of humour. Then there was one day I will never forget as long as I live, and this happened during a game of tag with my cousins. All of a sudden I remember seeing a dark, curious head peeking at us from behind a tree. But it happened so fleetingly I thought I'd imagined it. But I was to discover, to my amazement, that both my cousins had seen the face too. We discussed what we'd observed, and all agreed that the head had been cone-shaped and massive, with a grey leathery skin, and framed by dark hair, and it had looked distinctly human-like, but not quite. "What do you suppose it was?" asked Evelyn, "because it wasn't completely human, was it?" "I have no idea," I said, "but I think we should find out." So the following day, intrigued by our curious findings, we eagerly searched the woods to seek out the owner of that curious face, and we found several massive footprints in the mud that were so enormous that they dwarfed our own feet. We became excited and enthused by our discovery because we believed the footprints belonged to a giant, much like the one in Jack and the Beanstalk, for we knew of no man who had feet that large. And so it was we followed the footprints which led directly to a large rocky mountainous outcrop, of which some of the jutting ribbed stones were obviously being used as precarious makeshift steps, which were brushed with a slight residue of muddy leaves by someone who'd been climbing up the steep rocky ledges on the left-hand side of this rugged, craggy elevation. Whoever had climbed up this incline was clearly incredibly athletic, light on their feet, with an awesome sense of balance. So we decided to follow the muddy trail onwards and upwards, as in those days we were also agile and nimble enough to climb almost anything and everything, as we would rise to any challenge with a childlike zealousness. I will never forget when we accidentally glimpsed a sizable hole in the outcrop that had been cleverly wedged in with a mass of thin branches weaved and interwoven together to make what I can only describe as a very sizable door. I tugged at the door and it came out in my hand like a large plug and tumbled to the ground like the rounded fitting of a large bin, where it hit the ground with an almighty crash. We then proceeded to enter the cave ever so cautiously, with an amplified sense of enthusiasm and excitement, because discovering a cave like this was quite simply thrilling. I was already envisaging using this cave as our secret hideout, when I began to observe that the floor was carpeted with deer pelts. Someone had been here before us, and we could see chopped tree trunks scattered liberally around the cave, like makeshift chairs. Before I could say a single word, I became forebodingly aware that we were most certainly not alone, and that something or someone with nefarious intentions was scrutinizing us, and that was when, in the dark shadows of the cave, at about 8 feet off the ground, I detected this menacing, sinister red eye-shine, and this giant-sized demonical figure just staring back at us. I let out the most loud, terrified scream, which was followed by anguished cries of horror from both my cousins, who clearly had also seen the red eye shine. That thing that had been in the cave with us suddenly let out the most almighty, deep, guttural roar, and I've never been more afraid of anything in my entire life, because the sound was so chilling it caused my blood to turn cold. I was gripped with the most ineffable terror, and my cousins and I scrambled down the rocky incline as fast as we possibly could. It thundered behind us, whatever it was, at an alarming swift speed, and we could hear heavy footsteps, and whatever it was snorting and breathing deeply. None of us dared look back to see what it was that was chasing us, because we were so afraid. As the critter ran up close, he sounded like a rhino in full charge, and I was certain we were already dead. This thing, whatever in God's name it was, seemed so close behind us that I could smell its foul breath on my back. I was so sure it was going to grab us, but thankfully it did not. Once we returned to the farmhouse, we could no longer hear it any more. We slammed the front door behind us and were breathing so rapidly it took a long while to calm down our frazzled nerves. "Whatever is the matter with you?" asked my aunt. "I've never seen you all look so afraid. What is going on?" "It was something we were watching on television," I told her. Oh dear, muttered my aunt. "I do wish they'd stop feeding your brains with all this horror that you watch on television these days. It's doing none of you any good at all." After my aunt returned to the kitchen, Evelyn said, "What the heck was that?" All I could say was, "It was one hell of an ugly monster, whatever it was, and it scared the living daylights out of me. For a moment, I thought we were dead." As you can imagine, after such a horrifying fiasco, we never went to play back in the woods again, because the idea of encountering that monster was more than we could possibly bear. Fast forward to July of 1995, and my cousin Evelyn was having her 21st birthday party, and we were terribly excited about the celebratory event, as it was going to be a spectacular occasion and lots of our friends were being invited. We had hired an awesome DJ, and the verdant green lawn was going to be graced with a very sizable marquee that would be fitted with beautiful tables, and there would be an outside bar and a large buffet for salads, including a roast pork and lamb on the spit, all outside the tent. I was so excited, and on the Friday I left my home in Charleston and made the hours-long drive to my cousin's farm. I noticed that everybody had arrived at once, all decked out in their party clothes, and there was a long line of cars that were already parked on the long white pebbled driveway. I remember Evelyn and Aubrey looked stunningly elegant, both clad in long flowing sparkling silk dresses. Evelyn's was gold and Aubrey's silver, and both had delicate shoestring straps and high heels. My aunt had transformed the marquee into an exquisite showpiece, and there were generous bouquets of pink, purple, yellow and cream roses on every single table, which were swathed with shimmering mother-of-pearl tablecloths and matching upholstered chairs, and pretty garlands of fairy lights that covered the roof of the marquee, as well as hundreds of pink and purple balloons. The creme de la creme inside the marquee was a large black and white checkered dance floor where the DJ's equipment had been set up for all the dancing. On the pristine emerald green lawn, yards away from the wood grove where we used to play as young children, my aunt had placed several comfortable upholstered couches and little tables with snacks that surrounded a beautiful crackling fire, so you could sit and enjoy a drink while talking to a friend. If that wasn't enough pizzazz for you, to add to the magical ambience of this splendiferous event, gracing the paths, walkways and driveway were pretty bright lanterns. Most important of all, as far as every young person was concerned, was the quintessential bar, the perfect guarantee to get well and truly bladdered. And why not, as after all, you only ever turn 21 once. Before long the merry party began, and the booming sounds of the DJ's music could be heard all over the valley, including happy, joyful, loud screams and jubilant laughter as the crowds got seriously pumped up and ever so slightly inebriated as champagne and alcoholic beverages began to be drunk to excess by a more than enthusiastic, rambunctious young crowd. It was later on in the evening that some people began to complain that an intoxicated idiot loitering around in the woodgrove was having a field day by deliberately throwing stones at people as some kind of a sick joke, causing many people to become ever so slightly flustered. "It's sick," complained one of the party-goers. "This guy must be completely blasted. He's hiding behind the trees, throwing rocks. He could hurt someone." If that wasn't absurd enough, one young couple who decided to have a romantic thumble in the woods came tearing out of the woods half naked, complaining that a man spying on them, dressed in a very bad monkey suit, was having a joke at their expense, and had chased after them. They had never been so scared in all their lives, but no one owned up to wearing that monkey suit. In truth, when befuddled, tipsy people start talking such kind of senseless stuff at parties, you automatically assume that they were just blind drunk and fuddled, so no one took their claims even remotely seriously. Later on in the evening, I suddenly remembered that I'd left Evelyn's birthday present in my red Ford Pinto, so I surreptitiously returned to my car to retrieve it. I couldn't believe what I was discerning and stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I could feel the vibration of every single beat. And for a second I felt so discomposed, I literally froze to the spot, like a statue of ice, unable to move. Was I really seeing what I was seeing, or had all the fizzy champagne gone straight to my head and made me hallucinate, I wondered. I mean, I was feeling ever so slightly wobbly on my feet, and I was experiencing that tipsy feeling from drinking a little too much. Yet despite all the champagne, I knew that my eyes were not playing any tricks on me. I could see these colossal-sized humanoid apes willfully dragging people's cars all over the grass, moving them all over the place like you would furniture. They even placed some cars one on top of the other in piles. I mean, who has the strength to do something like that? But for these creatures it was light work, and the cars looked like kids' toys in their powerful hands. The outside lanterns helped me to see the critters clearly, and these things were Herculean in size, and there was about 5 of them, all between 7 to 8 foot tall, and possibly 3 feet across the chest, covered in long dark hair, although I could not detect the exact tonal shade of their colouring, because it was too dark to see that. The critters possessed pyramid-shaped heads that just flowed into their humongous shoulders in a seamless sweep, without any evidence of a neck to speak of. I was able to observe the overlong arms and very powerful strong legs, but the facial features of these creatures were washed away by the darkness of the night. I knew at once that this was the kind of creature that had chased us out of the cave when we were young. I could tell these vexed critters were not happy at all about the thunderous booming party music, and were expressing their resentful indignation by moving around people's cars and piling and stacking them up on top of each other, causing no end of damage. I could hear them snorting, grunting, and breathing heavily under their breaths. As it was a sleepover party, only the gravity of what had actually transpired the night before really astounded the party-goers the following morning, when we awoke to a scene of mass carnage and chaos. We were to discover that the marquee had been ripped to shreds, and tables and chairs flung haphazardly all over the place, and the carcasses of the pig and sheep had all but vanished. If that wasn't bad enough, when people saw what had actually happened with their cars, they were completely gobsmacked, because no one could comprehend who could have the strength to move their cars or to pile them on top of each other like this. I'll never forget the shocked reactions on people's faces when they stared in horror at their cars, hardly daring to believe what they were observing, with their hands over their mouths and their eyes as wide as saucers. "Who the hell did this?" said one girl, looking around at everyone very suspiciously. It appeared that one of the girls called Lucy had a very unfortunate laugh that had the capacity to rub you up the wrong way at the very best of times, and on this occasion it did not help, because she snorted loudly with laughter, secretly glad, I imagine, that her car was not in this pile-up, and finding it somewhat amusing to see such disarray and chaos. Unfortunately, everybody else failed to see the funny side of things and thought Lucy was somehow involved or responsible for this insidious prank. In a trice, a couple of girls began attacking her vengefully and fiercely pulling her hair, so things were stepping quite out of hand and becoming rather heated. "You think it's funny?" screamed one of the girls, yanking Lucy's ponytail hard. "Look what you did to my car," screamed the other girl, pushing Lucy so hard that she stumbled back on the ground. "It's all dented and damaged, thanks to you." "It wasn't me," the poor Lucy protested. "I promise you it wasn't me." "Stop that right now," shouted my aunt, taking her garden hose and soaking down the squabbling girls, who, drenched in water, soon came to their senses and looked utterly ashamed about their juvenile antics, because indeed I'd never seen them behave like that before. Everybody believed that someone at the party had gone a little too far-fetched and heavy-handed with party tricks, but how could they have moved people's cars and stacked them on top of each other like this? It wasn't physically possible, and deep down I think everybody knew that. I do remember directly after that party, poor Evelyn was terribly upset about what had happened to people's cars, and told my aunt that the best party in the world had been ruined by this disaster. My aunt told her that the party would never ever be forgotten in the years to come, and she wasn't wrong about that. Today, when Evelyn bumps into old school friends of hers, they always talk about the birthday party with the piled-up cars. "Oh, I remember that. It was so funny, all the cars piled up on top of each other," they would say. But I vividly recall they weren't very amused at the time. I now know, all these years later, that Bigfoot was indeed the perpetrator of this mysterious crime, because I actually saw those critters with my very own eyes dragging the cars around the lawn. But even today, I refuse to say a thing. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.